we need to talk about the biggest sort of national flashpoint of the day, and that is the shooting and killing of Ahmaud Arbery. I apologize if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. He's a 25-year-old black man who was killed in February after being chased by two armed men who told police he looked like a burglary suspect, according to the Washington Post. Here, the video is actually available of the shooting. It appears that the video was taken by a member of basically the posse of these two guys one of whom was a retired cop and his son. So in the video, what you're about to see, and it's very graphic. So if you don't want to watch this, then by all means, turn away. If you're listening to it, I'll describe it for you. But basically what you're about to see is this 25-year-old black man who appears to be jogging, and he is jogging down the road. And then right in front of him, there is a white pickup truck. In the back of the white pickup truck is an older gentleman, an older man who is carrying a gun. And outside of the truck is his son, who's in his 30s and is carrying a shotgun. And this whole thing is being filmed from behind, presumably by one of their friends, because why else would you just be filming a random black guy running down the road? Okay, so here's what the video shows. I'm going to play the video and I'll narrate it. So you can see that what's happening right here is Arbery jogging, right? I mean, he doesn't appear to be sprinting away or sprinting sideways. He sort of moves toward the left side of the truck. Then he proceeds to run around the right side of the truck when he sees he's being confronted. And there's a man there carrying a shotgun. And the man carrying the shotgun, he confronts the man with the shotgun, grabs the shotgun, and then you can see that they get into a fight. And at that point, the man with the shotgun appears to either pull the trigger or the gun is pulled and his finger's on the trigger, and Arbery is dead. I mean, Arbery is killed in the video. It also appears, and it's hard to tell, that the man on the back of the pickup truck, it looks like he takes a pot shot before any shot is fired from the shotgun, although it's difficult to tell from the video because the video is kind of grainy. So here is the backstory on this. And the white guys who shot the black guy, they were not prosecuted for 2 months. They were left to go free for 2 months. And that's where everybody is starting to go crazy because they're saying, okay, why for 2 months was nobody arrested for all of this? So here is the backstory, and then we'll go through the various legal arguments on behalf of first-degree murder versus second-degree murder / manslaughter in this particular case. Whatever you say, the legal case here to put these guys in jail is pretty strong. And there are several pieces I'm going to go through to talk about that today. Again, it's on tape. The tape is at least somewhat dispositive as to what happened here. If you were a man running down the road and you were confronted by people with guns and they were blocking your way in an attempt to stop you, it would not be out of your purview to run and try to fight the guy with the gun to try and get away, right? That they were literally attempting to obstruct him. It was not as though they pulled him. So their original narrative, as we'll see, is that they pulled off to the side of him and asked him to stop because they thought that he had burglarized something. There was not a lot of evidence, apparently, that they'd actually seen the burglary in process, which would change the status here under law because you're only allowed to pursue somebody and try to arrest them if you actually see a crime in progress. If you're going to make a citizen's arrest, there's an actual citizen's arrest law in the state of Georgia. That does not appear to have been fulfilled here. So they charge around so they stopped him, looks like in the middle of the road, and called a friend, and the friend is filming this whole thing. And if you're that guy and you're just running down the road and you see somebody, forget about race for a second. If you see somebody with a shotgun and a guy in the back of the pickup truck with a handgun and they're attempting to stop you and you've committed no crime and you can't get around them, what the hell else are you supposed to do? Right? That guy actually has an extraordinarily strong self-defense / stand your ground claim. The jogger does. Arbery does. Okay, so here is the lead up to all of this. This is according to the New York Times. Ahmaud Arbery loved to run. It was how the 25-year-old former high school football standout stayed fit, his friend said. It was not unusual to see him running around the outskirts of the small coastal Georgia city near where he lived. But on a Sunday afternoon in February, as Mr. Arbery ran through a suburban neighborhood of ranch houses and moss-draped oaks, he passed a man standing in his front yard, who later told the police that Arbery looked like a suspect in a string of break-ins. According to a police report, the man, Gregory McMichael, who's 64, called out to his son Travis McMichael, 34. They grabbed their weapons, a .357 Magnum, a revolver, and a shotgun, jumped into a truck, and began following Mr. Arbery. Okay, so as we will see, the question as to whether they actually witnessed a crime in progress and then got active is one of the operative questions here. You don't have the right to, let's say that 3 weeks ago, you saw a grainy videotape and you say, oh, hey, look, I saw a guy walk down the street, looks just like that suspect. In Georgia, you don't have the right to go grab your gun and try to arrest that guy. You can't effectuate a citizen's arrest unless you watched a crime in progress and you are attempting to stop the crime. This will become an issue. Stop, stop, they shouted at Mr. Arbery. We want to talk to you. Moments later, after a struggle over the shotgun, Arbery was killed, shot at least twice. No one has been charged or arrested in connection with the February 23rd killing. The case has received little attention beyond Brunswick, but it raised questions in the community about racial profiling because Arbery was black and the father and son are white, and about the interpretation of the state's self-defense laws. Now, again, the level of the charge is going to be at issue when this thing does go to court, because it will go to court. Number one, because how do you interpret the first-degree murder statute? They stopped dead in the middle of the road. If this was a false imprisonment connected with a killing, then it's first-degree murder, meaning that if this is the equivalent of a kidnapping because they had no evidence that the guy actually committed a crime, and then they shot him, then it's felony murder. If there was evidence that the guy had committed a crime, or if they thought he had committed a crime reasonably, right, this is what the jury is going to determine, then the attempt to arrest him could end up being something more akin to manslaughter, because it's fairly obvious when you have somebody videoing a situation like this from behind that you don't actually expect that it's going to end in somebody getting shot. Right? It makes no sense for these people's allies to be tracking this guy down the street because they want to watch him get shot on tape just so that these guys can get indicted, right? The tape is the most damning thing about this. If there had been no tape, it would be very difficult to indict because all you would have is the accounts of the people involved. Right? And that would be, again, very difficult on the basis of evidence, on evidence alone. The tape is the most damning thing about anything in this entire compendium of facts. Arbery was killed 3 days before the anniversary of the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin, the unarmed African-American teenager whose confrontation with a Florida neighborhood watch captain George Zimmerman helped ignite the Black Lives Matter movement. And it is important to distinguish the fact patterns of these particular cases. In that particular case, there was controversy because Zimmerman, again, followed Trayvon Martin by Zimmerman's testimony, which, again, there was no tape. Tape would have been very helpful in the George Zimmerman case. There was no tape in that case. Zimmerman testified that he followed Martin, then he turned around, and then Martin confronted him, and then Martin was on top of him by witness testimony, beating his head into the pavement. There was a struggle over the gun, and he shot Martin. That is a different fact pattern than this one, where you have two people lying in wait for the guy coming down the road, and then the guy, on basic self-defense grounds, attempts to defend himself. Also, as we will see, there's all sorts of racial stuff that came up in the Zimmerman case where the media basically lied about Zimmerman. They suggested that he was clearly doing this because he was a racist. They suggested that he was a white person, even though he was actually Hispanic, and then they termed him a white Hispanic. They suggested that there was no evidence that he'd actually been hit by Martin when, in fact, he had a broken nose. Right? There are all sorts of complicating factors in the George Zimmerman case, and that case was overcharged by the prosecution. If they'd charged him with manslaughter, fairly decent shot, they would have convicted him. But when it comes to this particular case, to get back to the fact pattern here, according to documents obtained by the New York Times, a prosecutor who had the case for a few weeks told the police the pursuers had acted within the scope of Georgia's citizen's arrest statute and that Travis McMichael, who held the shotgun, had acted out of self-defense. The police report doesn't mention whether Arbery was in possession of a weapon. Apparently, he was not. The prosecutor who wrote the letter was a guy named George Barnhill, who was the district attorney for Georgia's Waycross Judicial Circuit and had recused himself from the case this month after Arbery's family complained he had a conflict of interest. A prosecutor from another county was then put in charge, and then he decided that this thing will go to a grand jury yesterday. So the fact pattern is obviously in dispute here, but as we'll see, we'll go through the full analysis of the fact pattern momentarily. The fact pattern cuts in favor of an indictment at the very, very least. Friends and family say that Arbery was exercising. One of his friends said everybody in the community knows he runs. Others contend Arbery was up to no good. On the day of the shooting, apparently moments before the chase, a neighbor in Satilla Shores called 911, telling the dispatcher a black man in a white T-shirt was inside a house that was under construction and only partially closed in. And he's running right now, the man told the dispatcher. There he goes right now. Now, again, that is not a burglary, okay? So, like being on a construction site where there is nothing worth stealing is not a burglary. Have you ever walked in an open construction site? I have. Virtually everyone I know has. You're walking around a neighborhood, you want to see how they're constructing a house, and you walk into the construction site. That is not a crime. Okay, that's certainly not a crime where you get to chase someone down and then hold them at bay because you're waiting for the cops to come. In his letters to the police, Barnhill noted that Arbery had a criminal past. Court records show that Arbery was convicted of shoplifting and violating probation in 2018. 5 years earlier, according to the Brunswick News, he was indicted on charges he took a handgun to a high school basketball game, none of which is supremely relevant to what happened in this particular case. You bring a gun to a high school basketball game 5 years beforehand. That has no relevance as to why these particular people are trying to block your particular way on this particular highway. Just going through the fact pattern. Even if Arbery committed a property crime on the afternoon he was killed, activists and family members said it would not have warranted a chase by armed neighbors. And then we get into the racial issue, right? Arbery's mother said she believed the man had judged her son by his skin color. She does not believe he committed any crimes that day. If he had, she said, he should have been handled by the police. Now, I tend to agree it should have been handled by the police. When we get into the racial angle here, that's where things start to go sideways. The reason I say that is because certainly you can interpret this as a racial shooting. It's three white men apparently confronting a young black man in disputed circumstances and then killing him, right? I mean, then he is shot. The question as always, when it comes to overzealous people getting involved in cases like this, which is what it appears to be. Again, they had this on tape. What it appears to, is it about race? Is it about racism against a black man running in a largely white area? Or if the guy were Hispanic and were running through the neighborhood, would they have made the call? If it had been a guy who looked like he was a white guy who they were suspicious of, would they have made the same call? In other words, is it possible that these are overzealous cops who are overzealous cops? Turns out the guy was an ex-cop, right? And very often you do see this. I mean, this is the point that Adam Carolla has made before, that if you're a black person in America with the terrible history of law enforcement with black Americans, if you were pulled over for speeding as a black man and you didn't really think that you were speeding, and the white officer came and was rude to you, you might assume that it was because the officer was a racist. Because Adam Carolla is a white guy, he says, I would just assume that the officer is an a-hole, right? So it's unclear in this particular case whether it's racial. The same thing, by the way, was true with regard to the George Zimmerman case. In the George Zimmerman case, there were several investigations, including a federal investigation by the Eric Holder Justice Department that found no evidence of racial intent in that particular case. So we don't actually know whether there was racial intent here. The attempt to blow this up into a racial narrative, maybe, right? Maybe, but we don't have the evidence of that. Now, that does not change whether these guys should be indicted. So that brings us to the state of the law. Okay, so there are a couple of different pieces on this that are worth going through. One is from my friend David French, who is a very, very good lawyer over at the Dispatch. He says that the killers should be arrested and tried for murder. He says, let's walk through the events, and then he goes through all of the evidence. We'll go through all of the evidence in just 1 second. And we'll go through sort of the legal case. And then we'll get to the broader political ramifications, because one thing is obviously true. If the media can treat a terrible incident like this as an incident that indicts America more broadly along the lines of racism, it becomes a national story, and it doesn't stop being a national story, and the media encourages that. If it turns out that everybody's like, okay, this was a bad shooting, and maybe it was racist, and maybe it wasn't, but these guys should be at least tried, then the controversy goes away. How do I know this? Because that's exactly what happened in the case of Walter Scott, who is the black man in South Carolina who was gunned down by a police officer. The police officer lied about it. It was on tape. The police officer ended up his name was Michael Slagle. He ended up in jail for 20 years. No controversy whatsoever, because everybody basically agreed. You do a bad thing, you should go to jail. It's only when the media can turn it into a broader indictment of American racism that the media are interested in the story. So the fact that there seems to be pretty broad and wide agreement that these guys at the very least should go to a grand jury and be indicted and then get their day in court, it kind of cuts against the idea that Americans are deeply desirous of protecting people on the basis of a possible racial killing.